"Get out of my port, you're done," Gregory screamed, throwing my 15-year career into a cardboard box. I didn't argue. I just smiled, walked to my car, and prepared to press the button. They had no idea that the entire harbor ran on my name. To understand how we arrived at this point, you have to understand how a massive shipping operation actually works. People think logistics is just about big metal boxes and cargo ships. It is not. It is about paper, codes, and trust. For 15 years, I was the director of port operations for Summit Maritime Group. My office was not in some glassy high-rise in Manhattan. It was a metal double-wide trailer parked right next to the container crane tracks, where the floor shook every time a 40-foot box was dropped onto a chassis. My name is Frank Kowalski. I am 50 years old, and my entire adult life has been measured in 20-foot equivalent units, or T, every single day. Hundreds of containers pass through our gates. We handle everything from cheap plastic toys from Asia to sensitive Class 3 flammable liquids and temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals that will spoil if the refrigeration unit loses power for even 45 minutes. The terminal is a living, breathing monster that never sleeps. If a container sits on the dock for too long, the Port Authority charges a fee called demurrage. It starts small, but if you do not clear your cargo within the allowed free time, those fees compound until they can bankrupt a mid-sized importer in a week. My job was to make sure that never happened. I spent 15 years building a flawless relationship with the customs officers, the Port Authority inspectors, and the local longshoremen unions. I knew which inspectors were sticklers for structural integrity on flat-rack containers, and I knew exactly how to format a hazardous materials manifest so it did not get flagged for manual review by the Coast Guard. I regularly sat down with Big Mike, the union representative for the International Longshoremen's Association, over cheap breakfast sandwiches to resolve labor disputes before they could lead to a slowdown on the gantry cranes. The guys on the docks respected me because I had started my career 25 years ago, securing lashing wires on the lower decks of cargo vessels in freezing rain. I spoke their language, and they knew I would never ask them to load a damaged chassis or work under unsafe rigging, but the most important thing I had was not my experience. It was my license. I am a licensed U.S. customs broker. Under federal regulations, specifically Title 19 of the United States Code, a shipping corporation cannot simply clear cargo on its own. They need a licensed individual to sign off on the transactions to stand as the legally responsible party before U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Because Summit Maritime Group had grown rapidly, their corporate structure was messy. Instead of establishing a corporate customs power of attorney with a third-party agency, the founder of the company had asked me to use my personal license and credentials to secure their port access. This meant that I personally signed the customs broker power of attorney for Summit. I also stood as the individual principal on the continuous customs surety bonds, specifically under the provisions of 19 CFR Section 113.62 and the terminal letters of indemnity. In plain terms, if a cargo container carried contraband, if a shipment of chemicals leaked and damaged the pier, or if Summit failed to pay its customs duties, the federal government and the Port Authority would not just go after Summit. They would come after me, my license, and my personal bond. To protect myself, the founder of the company and I had signed a private, legally binding agreement separate from my employment contract. It stated that my personal letters of indemnity and the use of my customs broker credentials were tied directly to my active employment as the director of operations. If I was ever terminated or if I resigned, my personal liability guarantees and the associated customs credentials would be revoked immediately. The company would have a standard 30-day transition window to file new bonds and appoint a new licensed broker. The founder understood the risk and respected my position. We worked together for over a decade, and under my watch, Summit never paid a single dollar in demurrage, and our C-TPAT, which stands for Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, status was rated at Tier 3. The highest possible security rating that allowed our containers to bypass random physical inspections. Then, the founder retired. He sold his majority shares to a private equity firm, and they brought in a new CEO who immediately hired Gregory Cox as the vice president of operations. Gregory was 46 years old, wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and had never seen a shipping container from the inside. He was a numbers guy, the kind of executive who believed that experience was just an expensive word for inefficiency. He brought a team of young analysts who spent their days staring at spreadsheets, trying to find ways to shave fractions of a cent off our operational costs. In our very first meeting, Gregory looked at my department's budget and frowned. He did not ask about our low inspection rates or our relationship with the longshoremen. He looked at the line item for drayage, the local trucking service that hauls containers from the ship terminal to our regional distribution warehouses. We had been using a local unionized carrier for 10 years. They were expensive, but their drivers all had active transportation worker identification credentials, or TWIC cards, and their trucks were fully compliant with C-TPAT security requirements. Gregory tapped his pen on the printout and said we were overpaying. He told me he had found a new private carrier that could do the job for 40% less. I looked at the name of the new carrier, Cox Logistics Solutions. It did not take a detective to figure out the connection. The owner of the carrier was Ryan Cox, Gregory's 28-year-old cousin. I told Gregory that the carrier did not have the necessary certifications to enter the port security zones, nor did they have the specialized chassis required to haul our heavy hazmat loads. Gregory just smiled, leaned back in his chair, and told me that times were changing, and I needed to get with the program or get out of the way. The transition to Cox Logistics Solutions was a disaster from the first day, just as I had warned. On a Tuesday morning, 3 of Ryan Cox's trucks arrived at the gate to pick up a shipment of imported automotive components for our primary client, Detroit Auto Alliance. The drivers did not have TWIC cards. They tried to present temporary state IDs at the port security gate, and the Port Authority police turned them away immediately. Gregory was furious. He called my office, demanding that I use my personal clearance and terminal access credentials to bypass the security check and vouch for the drivers. I refused. I told him that my credentials were tied to my license, and I was not risking a federal fine and a permanent black mark from U.S. Customs and Border Protection just to cover for his cousin's unqualified drivers. 2 weeks later, the situation escalated from incompetence to outright negligence. I was walking the container yard with Linda Reyes, our customs compliance manager, when we noticed a batch of 40-foot containers that had just been unloaded from a vessel originating from Rotterdam. These containers carried high-value volatile solvents, classified as Class 3 hazardous materials, destined for Detroit Auto Alliance's main assembly plant in Michigan. Because these were chemical shipments, they were subject to strict C-TPAT regulations. They required high security seals that met the ISO 17712 standard. These seals are heavy metal bolts designed to prevent tampering during transit, and their unique serial numbers must be verified at every transfer point. When Linda and I inspected the containers, we found that the original security seals had been cut and replaced with cheap, plastic pull-tight seals that did not even have registered serial numbers. Ryan Cox's drivers had reportedly cut the original seals during a transfer at an off-site yard because they claimed they needed to check the cargo weight distribution. This was a flagrant violation of federal shipping security laws. If U.S. Customs found out that we were transporting hazardous chemicals with unverified, non-compliant seals, Summit Maritime could lose its C-TPAT accreditation instantly, causing every single container we imported to be subject to manual inspections, delaying deliveries by weeks. I immediately ordered the yard cranes to hold the containers and refused to release them to Ryan's trucks. I told Linda to document the seals and file an internal compliance hold. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Gregory. He did not ask about the safety violation or the risk to the cargo. He was screaming. He told me that Detroit Auto Alliance was running on a tight schedule, and if those containers did not leave the terminal by noon, the assembly line in Michigan would face a shutdown. He ordered me to sign the gate release slips and log the seals as compliant. I told him I would not do it. I explained that signing off on false seal verifications on a hazmat shipment was a federal crime, and since it was my customs broker license and my personal surety bond guaranteeing the compliance of this terminal, I had the final authority. Gregory scoffed and told me to get up to his office immediately. When I walked into the executive suite on the top floor of the terminal building, Gregory was sitting behind his mahogany desk. Next to him was Brenda Larson, the Director of Human Resources. Brenda looked uncomfortable, staring at a folder in front of her. Gregory did not ask me to sit. He just tossed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a termination letter. He told me that my services were no longer required at Summit Maritime Group. He claimed my refusal to release the chemical containers constituted insubordination and deliberate sabotage of the company's business operations. He said they were terminating my employment for cause, effective immediately. I picked up the paper, read it carefully, and looked at Brenda. I asked her about my accrued performance commissions. Over the last 4 quarters, I had managed to keep our port terminal operating costs 10% under budget while maintaining a zero demurrage record. According to my contract, I was owed $180,000 in performance bonuses, plus 6 months of severance pay. Gregory let out a dry laugh. He said that since I was being fired for cause due to insubordination and endangering a major client contract, the company was withholding all bonuses, commissions, and severance. He told me I would receive my final salary payment for the current week, and that was it. He pointed to a cardboard box on the floor and told me I had 20 minutes to pack up my personal belongings from the operations trailer under the supervision of a terminal security guard. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the desk, and I did not threaten to sue. I spent 15 years in the shipping industry, and if there is one thing you learn when dealing with shipping unions, port authorities, and maritime lawyers, it is that anger is a waste of energy. The person who wins is the one who has the cleaner paperwork. I looked at Gregory and said, "Understood." I signed the termination receipt, acknowledging that I had received the notice. I made sure to take my copy of the document. Then I walked back down to my operations trailer. The security guard stood by the door, looking embarrassed as I packed my desk. I did not take anything that belonged to Summit. I left the company-issued laptop, the keys to the terminal vehicle, and the operational logs. But I did pack my personal documents. I took my original framed U.S. Customs broker license from the wall. I took the private agreement I had signed with the retired founder 15 years ago, the one specifying the relationship between my employment and the use of my personal credentials. I also took the paperwork for my personal surety bond and the letters of indemnity I had filed with the Port Authority. As I walked out of the gate with my single cardboard box, I saw Ryan Cox standing next to his cousin's shiny new pickup truck, grinning at me. I did not look back. I got into my car, drove home, and immediately called my attorney, Arthur Pendleton, who specialized in maritime law and contract disputes. The trap had been set by Gregory, but he had no idea that the floor he was standing on was built entirely on my name. The morning after my termination, I met Linda Reyes at a small diner 3 miles away from the Port of Newark terminal. She looked exhausted. She told me that Gregory had officially appointed Ryan Cox's logistics firm as the primary transport provider for the entire Newark operation. Worse, Gregory had instructed the operations team to continue using my electronic customs signature and broker identification number to process the incoming manifests. They were pretending I was still on a transitional leave of absence, using my active license and the surety bonds I had personally guaranteed to clear high-priority shipments. They were doing this because they knew that without my active license, they would have to file a new bond application, a process that takes weeks and requires a clean compliance audit that Ryan's trucking company could never pass. I called my attorney, Arthur Pendleton. We met at his office in downtown Newark, surrounded by stacks of maritime shipping acts and federal regulations. I showed him my contract, the termination letter, stating I was fired with cause for sabotage, and the private agreement I had signed with the company's founder 15 years ago. Arthur read through the documents, a slow smile spreading across his face. He explained that by firing me immediately and denying me my accrued commissions and severance, Summit Maritime Group had breached our employment agreement. More importantly, the moment they terminated my contract, their legal right to use my personal customs broker credentials and my personal surety bonds ended. By continuing to use my electronic credentials to clear containers, they were committing customs fraud under federal law, specifically Title 19 of the United States Code, Section 1641. "Frank," Arthur said, leaning back in his leather chair, "they think they can just keep using your name to keep the port gate open while they withhold your money. We are going to close that gate." We spent the next 4 hours drafting and filing 3 separate, highly targeted legal documents. First, we sent an emergency revocation notice directly to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Port Director for the Port of New York and New Jersey. We officially revoked the customs broker power of attorney that I had granted to Summit Maritime Group. We attached my signed termination letter as proof that my employment had ended, and we requested the immediate deactivation of my electronic customs filing account and the associated broker ID number. We referenced the revocation of the power of attorney form CBPP Form F291, making it a matter of official record. Second, we sent a formal cancellation notice to the surety company that issued the continuous customs bonds. Under federal regulations, a surety bond guarantor must be notified immediately of any material change in the risk profile of the principal. I notified them that I was no longer the operating principal overseeing the cargo compliance, and I formally withdrew my personal assets as collateral for the bonds. Without my guarantee, the surety company had no choice but to suspend the bonds, rendering them inactive within 24 hours. Finally, we compiled a detailed compliance deviation report and submitted it directly to the C-TPAT coordinator at CBP. I included the dated photographs Linda and I had taken of the non-compliant plastic seals on the Class 3 hazardous chemical containers transported by Ryan Cox's trucks. I pointed out that the carrier was operating inside the port security zones without active TWIC clearances or C-TPAT certified security seals, which constituted a direct threat to port security under the Safe Port Act of 2006. Under the Tariff Act of 1930, U.S. Customs takes cargo security and hazardous materials manifests extremely seriously. When a licensed broker reports a systemic failure in container seal integrity and revokes their bond, the system does not wait for a corporate response. It triggers an automatic security protocol. As we walked out of Arthur's office, he looked at his watch. "The Federal Registry updates at midnight," he said. "By tomorrow morning, Summit Maritime is going to find out what happens when you try to run a shipping terminal without a foundation." I went home and spent the rest of the afternoon working in my garden. For the first time in 15 years, my phone did not ring every 20 minutes with news of delayed crane operators, broken chassis, or customs holds. It was quiet, but I knew that across the river, at the port of Newark, the electronic gears of Summit Maritime Group were about to grind to a halt. Gregory Cox thought he was a corporate kingmaker because he knew how to read a spreadsheet. He was about to learn that a spreadsheet cannot move a 40-foot container through a federal customs checkpoint. By Thursday morning, the administrative gears of the federal government had turned, and the port of Newark became a parking lot. When the first shift of Ryan Cox's trucks arrived at the terminal gate to pick up the morning cargo, the electronic scanners did not flash green. Instead, a red light blinked and the gate barrier remained down. The system flagged the shipments because the customs bonds associated with Summit Maritime Group were listed as suspended. Without an active surety bond, a terminal operator cannot legally release imported cargo from the customs security area. Within 3 hours, the backup began. Summit had 2 large container vessels docked at the berth, with cranes unloading boxes at a rate of 30 containers per hour. But nothing was leaving the yard. The container stacks grew taller, filling every available slot in the terminal. When the yard reached its maximum capacity, the Port Authority ordered the cranes to stop unloading. The container ships were forced to sit idle at the berth, racking up thousands of dollars in charter fees every hour. Then came the federal enforcement. Based on the compliance report I had filed, CBP inspectors arrived at the terminal accompanied by Department of Homeland Security officers. They issued a mandatory intensive physical examination order on every single container associated with Summit Maritime Group. A physical inspection means that the containers cannot simply be cleared via paperwork. They must be moved to a centralized examination station, opened, and manually inspected by customs officers to verify the cargo manifests and security seals. For Summit, this was the ultimate bottleneck. An intensive exam costs about $1,000 per container in handling and transportation fees, and the process takes days. With over 400 containers caught in the gridlock, the initial inspection fees alone were heading toward $400,000. But the real financial bleeding was the demurrage. Under our terminal access agreement, the Port Authority granted 5 free days for standard containers, but for hazardous materials and refrigerated cargo, the free time was only 48 hours. Once that window expired, the demurrage fees began. $350 per container per day for the first 5 days, doubling to $700 per day thereafter. With 400 containers stuck, Summit was facing a daily fee of $280,000, compounding every 24 hours. At noon on Thursday, my personal phone began to vibrate. It was Gregory Cox. I let it ring. He called 3 more times, then sent a text message in all capital letters. "Call me immediately. This is a legal matter." I waited until I had finished my lunch, then dialed his number. The moment he picked up, he was shouting so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Frank, what the hell did you do?" Gregory screamed. "The Port Authority has locked our gates. Customs is auditing every single one of our shipments. We have 400 containers sitting on the dock, and our major client, Detroit Auto Alliance, just called to report that their Michigan assembly plant is shutting down its transmission line because the components are stuck in our yard. Do you have any idea what this is costing us?" I sat back on my porch, listening to the panic in his voice. "I have a pretty good idea, Gregory," I said calmly. "At $700 a day per container in demurrage, plus the carrier detention fees and ship berth penalties, I'd estimate you're losing about $350,000 a day, and that doesn't include the Detroit Auto Alliance breach of contract penalties." "You did this," Gregory yelled. "You went to customs and sabotaged our bonds. Our lawyers are preparing a lawsuit against you for tortious interference, breach of contract, and theft of corporate trade secrets. We will take your license, your house, and everything you own." "Gregor," I said, my voice quiet and steady, "you terminated my employment for cause. The moment you did that, the private agreement linking my personal license and surety bonds to Summit Maritime became void. I did not sabotage your bonds. I simply withdrew my personal collateral from a company that no longer employs me. If your new operations team did not realize that the entire clearance system was run under my personal credentials, that is an operational oversight on your part. As for your lawsuit, my attorney's name is Arthur Pendleton. I suggest your legal team contact him directly. Do not call this number again." I hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, Linda Reyes sent me a message. She said the atmosphere in the executive suite was pure panic. The CEO, Charles Vance, had just flown in from the corporate headquarters in Chicago. He had spent the morning on the phone with the executive vice president of Detroit Auto Alliance, who had formally notified Summit that they were holding them liable for $1.2 million for every day the assembly plant remained closed due to the cargo hold. The board of directors was demanding answers, and Gregory's cousin's trucking company was being ordered off the port property by the Port Authority police due to the security violations. The system was collapsing just as I knew it would. In the logistics business, people like Gregory think they can cut corners because they do not see the invisible threads holding the entire supply chain together. They think the rules are just suggestions, and that the people who enforce them are just obstacles. They only realize the value of the foundation when the entire house falls on their heads. On Friday morning, my attorney, Arthur Pendleton, received a call from the personal office of Charles Vance, the CEO of Summit Maritime Group. There were no threats this time. The tone was desperate. Charles wanted an emergency meeting at Arthur's office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He asked if I would be present. I told Arthur I would attend, but only if they brought a certified corporate check. When Charles Vance walked into our conference room, he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days. His tie was loosened and his eyes were bloodshot. He was accompanied by the company's general counsel, a senior partner from a top Manhattan firm who looked equally exhausted. Gregory Cox was nowhere to be seen. Charles did not waste time with pleasantries. He sat down, placed his briefcase on the table, and looked at me. "Frank," he said, his voice quiet, "we need this resolved today. The Port Authority is threatening to suspend our terminal operating license if we do not clear the container gridlock by Monday morning. Detroit Auto Alliance has already filed a formal notice of intent to sue, and the shipping lines are charging us detention fees on the vessels. We are looking at a total liability that could exceed $6 million by next week. What is it going to take to get your license and bonds reinstated?" Arthur smiled and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was our settlement proposal. "It's very simple, Charles," Arthur said. "First, Summit Maritime will pay Frank his full accrued performance commissions of $180,000. Second, you will pay a severance package equal to 3 times his annual salary, which comes to $300,000, as compensation for wrongful termination and damage to his professional reputation. Third, the company will issue a formal, written retraction of the termination for cause, stating that Frank resigned in good standing, and you will purge any mention of insubordination or sabotage from his personnel file." The general counsel looked at the figures and began to protest. "This is extortion. We could tie this up in court for years." "You could," Arthur replied calmly, "but by next week, your company will be in bankruptcy. Every day those containers sit, you lose $350,000. Our proposal costs you $480,000. It's a simple math problem." Charles Vance raised his hand, silencing his attorney. He looked at me. "Is that all, Frank?" "No," I said, leaning forward. "There are 2 operational conditions. First, Gregory Cox is to be terminated for gross negligence and corporate misconduct, effective immediately. His cousin's carrier, Cox Logistics Solutions, will have its contract terminated, and they will be banned from entering any Summit terminal facility. Second, Linda Reyes will be promoted to Director of Port Operations with full autonomy over compliance and carrier selection." Charles took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then nodded. "Gregory is already gone. I fired him this morning after we discovered he had authorized the operations team to use your electronic signature without your consent after your termination. The board is currently preparing a civil suit against him to recover the demurrage losses. As for the trucking company, we have already reinstated our contract with our old unionized carrier." He opened his briefcase, pulled out a checkbook, and wrote a corporate check for $480,000. He pushed it across the table to Arthur, who verified the signatures and routing numbers. Then Charles signed the settlement agreement and the formal retraction letter. "The paperwork for the new customs bond has been drafted," Charles said, looking at me with a tired expression. "We just need your signature to authorize the temporary reinstatement of your license under a transitional advisory agreement for the next 30 days. I signed the authorization documents. It took less than 2 minutes. With my signature, the electronic holds at CBP would be lifted, the surety bonds would be reinstated, and the gates at the Port of Newark would open once again. As we stood up to leave, Charles looked at me. "You really had us by the throat, Frank?" "No, Charles," I said, picking up my coat. "You had yourselves by the throat. I just let go of the rope." 2 weeks later, Linda Reyes resigned from Summit Maritime Group. She had spent those 2 weeks cleaning up the mess Gregory had left behind, ensuring the Detroit Auto Alliance containers were cleared and the C-TPAT credentials were secure. Once the transition was complete, she joined me. Using the $480,000 settlement, I had rented a small office overlooking the Newark shipping terminal and established Newark Maritime Consulting. We specialize in customs compliance, port security, and logistics risk management. Many of Summit's oldest clients, including several major distributors who had been terrified by the port shutdown, reached out to us. They realized that their supply chains were only as secure as the people managing the paperwork. Now, when I sit at my desk and look out the window at the port of Newark, I see the massive container ships gliding under the Bayonne Bridge, their decks stacked high with colorful metal boxes. I see the trucks moving smoothly through the gates, their security seals verified, their manifests clear, the port is running smoothly again. But now they pay me by the hour just to make sure the gate stays open.